This video is an overview of the Vietnam War. So let's start by talking about when the Vietnam War occurred and really what was it. The Vietnam War really begins in the late 1950s, in 1956 to be exact, and U.S. quote-unquote advisors are present there from that time on. But combat units, full U.S. combat units, enter in 1965 and don't leave until 1973. This was the longest war the U.S. was involved in until the war in Afghanistan. So Vietnam today is just one country, and here it is, it's pink on this map. There's just one Vietnam, and its neighbors here are Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and of course China to the north. But during the Vietnam War, there were two Vietnams, and this is the legacy of French colonial control over Vietnam. When Vietnam successfully got its independence from the French, famously in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which is right here, as part of the peace process, the parties agreed to partition Vietnam right here so that there's a North Vietnam, which was controlled by a communist government, and South Vietnam, which was non-communist. The North Vietnamese want to reunify the country in the years after this peace agreement so that there's just one Vietnam, and the U.S. and other Western powers would prefer that that not occur. So the Vietnam War is an example of a Cold War proxy war where two parties are fighting through a country. In this case, you've got the Soviets and the Chinese supporting North Vietnam and the U.S. supporting South Vietnam. So effectively, the Soviets and the Chinese and the U.S. are fighting each other, but through Vietnam. The Vietnam War is not contained just to Vietnam. It spreads to Laos and Cambodia as well. Why did the U.S. get involved in Vietnam in the first place? Well, the U.S. involvement is based upon the strategy of containment, the Cold War philosophy that you must contain communism, limit its spread. And there's a fear that if you don't, if one country becomes communist, it may spread to neighboring countries, what's called the domino theory, like the way dominoes fall down and knock each other down. So here's a great quote by JFK, actually from when he was a senator before he became president. That's a great exemplar of the domino theory. Burma, Thailand, India, Japan, and the Philippines, and obviously Laos and Cambodia, are among those whose security would be threatened if the red tide of communism overflowed into Vietnam. As I said, the North wants to unify the country, North Vietnam, and they see that the Western resistance to allowing them to do so is, in their minds, a colonial interference in their country's affairs. So at first they see the French trying to control them as a colonial power, as a colony, and then they see the U.S. as doing so. They want this foreign interference to get out of Vietnamese affairs. The excuse for U.S. involvement is actually something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This is a naval battle that happens in the waters off of northern Vietnam in 1964. And at the time, it looked like the Vietnamese were being very aggressive toward an American ship and firing upon this ship first, and then the U.S. retaliating. Now, since 2005, these NSA documents have been released, have been unclassified, and we now know that actually it was the U.S. who fired first on the Vietnamese. And so once again, we see here an event in U.S. history where it was slightly or more than slightly exaggerated, staged, misrepresented to Congress and the American people in order to justify an invasion that was really not about naval battles, but was very much about the Cold War context, the need to, in the minds of the U.S. government, prevent the domino theory and pursue the policy of containment. The enemy in the Vietnam War for the U.S. isn't just northern Vietnam. It's the guerrilla group, and guerrilla not like monkeys, but guerrilla like guerrilla, in South Vietnam known as the Viet Cong. The Vietnamese referred to this as the National Liberation Front, sometimes just as Viet Cong. They're supported by the North Vietnamese government, but they operate in South Vietnam, trying to drive out the U.S. and to take down the U.S.-supported Vietnamese government, which changes over the course of the war. The government does. The Viet Cong has a great deal of support even in the South because the people of South Vietnam in general hate their government. It's a government that's largely Catholic, and most Vietnamese are Buddhist. And it's a government that's very corrupt and is seen over time as becoming more and more the puppet of the U.S. The Viet Cong is also sometimes called just the VC by the Americans for short, and VC in the NATO alphabet stands for, or is said as Victor Charlie. So sometimes members of the Viet Cong are called just Charlie, which is a phrase you'll hear a lot in literature and in movies about the Vietnam War. So some key features of the war. You're dealing here with the U.S. and South Vietnam. Their power is totally derived from their superior military, from superior firepower and their ability to inflict airstrikes on the Viet Cong and on North Vietnam. The U.S. troop deployment in Vietnam escalates dramatically after 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. You see the red line. It represents U.S. troop deployment in Vietnam. And this chart compares it to deployment in Korea during the Korean War and more recently in the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq and the Middle East. So at its height, the U.S. deployment in Vietnam exceeded 500,000 soldiers at any given time on the ground. Meanwhile, though, the U.S. is fighting against the strength of the North Vietnamese, which is guerrilla warfare, and the VC are relying on guerrilla warfare. So this picture demonstrates U.S. soldiers trying to get into and infiltrate the tunnel system that the VC have carved out in South Vietnam, which is one of the many ways that despite American military prowess, the VCs were able to avoid capture or even detection, was by hiding in the jungle and sometimes even underground, like in these tunnels. Some key terms you need to know are that were used frequently in the war. First, Ho Chi Minh, as I mentioned, is the president of North Vietnam. LBJ is the U.S. president for much of the war, Lyndon B. Johnson, until Nixon takes over. Agent Orange and napalm are both chemical weapons used by the U.S. during the war. Agent Orange is a chemical weapon and napalm is a defoliant. So it was dropped from planes and helicopters to burn up the jungle in order to expose the Vietnamese settlements or paths below. And it caused a great deal of destruction for any civilians caught in its path. The Tet Offensive is an important battle in 1968 where, despite the fact that the North Vietnamese lost the battle, they proved their strength, and it made the U.S. reconsider just how much support they had from the South Vietnamese to win the war, which leads to the Nixon policy of Vietnamization, as he called it, basically transferring the war from U.S. Military forces to South Vietnamese military forces over the course of the early 70s. And here you can see one final term, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In the middle of this map, the red arrow pointing down shows you this pathway. It was a 6-month-long supply route where North Vietnamese government forces could transfer weaponry and supplies to the VC in South Vietnam, to the Viet Cong, along this trail that ran through Laos and Cambodia, which was another way that the U.S. military justified extending the war into Laos and Cambodia, because unless they could cut off the supplies of the VC, there was no point in fighting. Okay, so the results of the war for the U.S. obviously massively destructive for those who served in the war. Soldiers come home with extreme PTSD and other physical injuries. There are also many deaths in the war, many casualties, and this just shows you in the Vietnam War, 58,000 casualties of the U.S., which makes it the 4th most deadly war that the U.S. has fought. The American Civil War, obviously the most because both sides were American. It was also very destructive for Vietnam. Between 800,000 and 3 million Vietnamese are killed in the war. Between 200 and 300,000 Cambodians are killed, and between 20,000 and 200,000 Laotians are killed. In 1975, after the U.S. has withdrawn from Vietnam, North Vietnam captured South Vietnam and reunified the country. Still, Vietnam is still technically a communist country, though it does have more economic openness than communism necessarily believes in philosophically, so in that sense it's a little bit like China. This also raises the question, did the U.S. actually lose the Vietnam War? Because if Vietnam eventually became a communist country, the North Vietnamese successfully took over the South. Well, the answer is yes, if that was the goal. If the goal was to prevent Vietnam from becoming communist, we did lose the war. But if the goal was to prevent communism from spreading to the rest of Southeast Asia, you could say that we won it.